Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour Quarantined. I'm Michael Walker and today I'm joined from their respective living rooms by Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. I went for a run today, went around Victoria Park. There were lots of people, enjoying the fresh air, but also staying at a safe distance from one another. So I'm feeling, quite, obviously it's not a positive situation, but I like to make the best of things. Ash, how are you doing?
I am bitterly disappointed because it turns out I suck at making bread. I just completely suck at making bread. I did try and make a white loaf using dead yeast, and I ended up with this dense, starchy cannonball, which was just deeply unpleasant to eat. And yeah, that's what I've learned about myself in the last 2 days.
But that's just bad luck. Dead yeast is bad luck, right?
That's not going to be one of your Instagram lives then, bread
absolutely
making.
Not. I mean, I thought I'd give baking bread a go by myself before trying to attempt it for an Instagram live. But I think I might just stick with my sort of put all the spices, stick it in the oven, usual way of cooking, not this stuff which requires precision and proving.
All right, tonight we are talking about whether in this fight against coronavirus, we really are all in this together. Specifically, we'll be asking why Prince Charles could get tested for COVID-19 before frontline NHS staff and what we should make of the newly announced NHS volunteer service, which over 400,000 people have signed up to in the past 24 hours. But first, I want to briefly take us back to one of the themes from yesterday's episode. On that show, we discussed Tim Martin's very shoddy decision to lay off his 40,000 staff, Wetherspoons, without pay, telling them to wait until government funding came through or to find a job at Tesco. That caused outrage among Wetherspoons staff and online protests from their union. And today, they forced Tim Martin into a U-turn. So let's get up the Bakers Union statement released an hour and a half ago that says it's the Wetherspoons Workers Force Company U-turn. We, the workers represented by the Bakers Union, welcome Wetherspoons' decision to U-turn on not paying its staff until the end of April. However, we await confirmation we will be paid 100% of our wages, as this is not yet clear. Furthermore, there has been no comment on paying staff the bonuses they are owed. The undue stress and anxiety caused by the company to its 40,000 plus employees was unnecessary, callous and cruel. Nobody should have to worry about paying bills, rent or buying food. This was an active decision by the government in the midst of a crisis that is affecting the entire world. The power of workers coming together is evidently stronger than ever. We will not forget this abandonment by the company of its workers. There's power in a union. So the background there was, Tim Martin was saying, don't come into work next week. And also, I'm not going to pay you next week. I will pay you at the point at which the government, put out the cash on their worker retention scheme. But that was seeming like it was going to be a while. Obviously, the workers were very worried they were going to end up broke. They fought back. They've won 2 lessons there. 1, joining a union works. And 2, if you want to be a shitty boss to 40,000 people, one of the more risky moments to choose is in the middle of a global pandemic. I want to get a quick comment from both of you, Aaron and Ash, before we go on to discuss our COVID positive prince. Does the coronavirus crisis make it harder than usual for bosses to get away with screwing over their employees?
Well, there's more scrutiny at this time because absolutely every single person in this country is affected in some way by the instability of their income at the moment, unless you're a producer of latex gloves. So it's a bigger story. There's going to be more attention generated by, shitty treatment of your employees now than there normally would be. Also with a captive social media audience just refreshing the news and refreshing the feeds all day, it's also possible to get a story going viral in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do it under normal circumstances. But I think that this highlights 2 big issues. One is that in placing so much power in the hands of employers when it comes to making sure that people's incomes are protected during the pandemic, the government has also kind of emboldened shitty employers. It was one of the conditions negotiated by the unions was that the payments would be made available when employers applied for them as a way of sort of maintaining this bond between unions and employers, the workforce and their employers as well. But it does lead to these sort of bottlenecks and crises and delays on payments if you've got a particularly crappy boss. One of the things that universal basic income has going for it is that it does just take away that power from terrible bosses like, Tim Martin or like Mike Ashley. It would also be available to those workers who've been left behind, so freelancers, the self-employed, people on 0 hours contracts. So this is a sort of structural wrinkle in the way in which this payment has been organised.
I respect your relentless repping of UBI, Ash, every time you come on the show during this coronavirus crisis. Very good.
Got to keep it consistent.
Yeah, exactly. Not like the government's policy when it comes to COVID-19. Aaron, I mean, for me, probably the big issue here is that normally when workers are laid off or when people are made to take benefits, what the establishment will try and do is blame the victim, blame the person who has become unemployed, or say, this is life, your industry's gone bust. That becomes impossible, doesn't it, really, when you've got a national crisis of this proportion and this degree?
Well, yeah, because there's always a political context for workers being laid off, but now it's kind of more obvious than ever before. What I'd want to say, however, is that the way that Tim Martin's been behaving, particularly over the last week, we saw yesterday a clip from him saying that pubs shouldn't be shut down. There was very little transmission of COVID-19 in pubs as opposed to supermarkets. I mean, what's the evidence of that? Suggests that he's in a very erratic state of mind. And you have to understand, these are 40,000 workers that we're talking about. He was telling 40,000 workers via a video he recorded in his kitchen where he looked slightly drunk that they should go and apply for jobs at Tesco. Now, if you're a shareholder in JD Wetherspoon, that's insane. And you don't want that gentleman as the figurehead for your business. And so I think that offers a glimpse, actually, of just how panicked many, many people will be at the senior levels of not just politics, but also business. We saw something similar with Mike Ashley yesterday, trying to open up Sports Direct and claiming it was, his workers were offering an emergency service. And the reason why that's happening, the reason why otherwise intelligent people, and Tim Martin is intelligent, the whole yokel, sort of tribune of the people, populist thing, that's a pitch. That's public relations. He's a clever guy. He's overseen the growth of a huge business empire. The reason why he's behaving so erratically is because we're now living in unprecedented times. Goldman Sachs is saying that the first quarter of this year will see minus 6% contraction in the US economy. Second quarter, minus 24%. This is an order of magnitude bigger than 2008. And in that context, it makes sense that you see business leaders who are otherwise quite sensible, quite strategic, say really dumb things like to 40,000 employees, go find a job elsewhere. That's a really daft thing to say, because let's say we go back to business as usual in 2 months. We won't, by the way, but let's say we do. And let's say they all go to work for other businesses. JD Wetherspoons has a massive, massive problem in terms of recruitment. And so what that suggested to me more than anything else was, wow, he's really lost it. And I expected the U-turn, but not this quickly.
I suppose the wager he was making that at the end of this crisis, when the pubs are ready to reopen again, unemployment will still be incredibly high, and so there will be enough people to get to work behind his bar. But we'll go on to our first major story of the day, which is about Prince Charles. Today, we discovered coronavirus has zero respect for royalty. That's right, and leading the news all day today has been Prince Charles testing positive for COVID-19. On the BBC, the principal question they've been asking is when Prince Charles was last in contact with his 93-year-old mother, that's for obvious reasons, is also being used as evidence of a national crisis which knows no class boundaries. For example, in response to the news, Nick Robinson, ex-BBC political editor and current host of the Today programme, tweeted, "We're all in this together. The Prince of Wales has tested positive for coronavirus. Clarence House says he is displaying mild symptoms but otherwise remains in good health." So it's that we're all in it together point that we're interested in. However, many on social media have questioned whether Nick Robinson and his ilk are missing the real story here. How did another rich and famous individual managed to get a coronavirus test when we still aren't able to test healthcare workers on the front line. This is obviously on the back of stories of Idris Elba, who was another rich and famous person in this country who managed to get tested for coronavirus. In their defense, they were aware this criticism was going to come. Clarence House have said that Charles did meet the NHS criteria for a test due to his age and pre-existing health conditions, but I'm not entirely convinced he's really getting equal treatment. Let's turn to a couple of quotes from the Guardian write-up of the story today, which I think are quite telling. So the first, Charles was tested on Monday after qualifying for an NHS test due to age and medical condition criteria in Aberdeenshire. He received the results on Tuesday. It is thought he was tested at Birkhall, his home on the Queen's Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire. So what they're claiming there is that, he has the criteria, he's of an age and has enough pre-existing conditions that coronavirus would be a threat to him, and therefore he has a right to have a test under usual NHS conditions. The bit that, rung some alarm bells for me there was that he was tested at his home on the Queen's Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire. I'm not sure that's what's happening as I'll show. I'm not really sure that standard 72-year-olds at this point are getting this kind of home testing. But obviously, as I always say, I'm not an expert about these things. I'm not a doctor. So I did, before this show, text one of my doctor friends, someone who does work in microbiology and specifically in testing. So I asked whether a non-royal 72-year-old would get at-home testing and results within 24 hours. Her response, this is verbatim, "Lol, no, they definitely wouldn't. We are waiting 24 to 48 hours for really sick inpatients." That's people in hospital. It's an infection control nightmare. So the treatment that Prince Charles got was far from ordinary. There's also a more obvious example in the story of how the impact of COVID-19 varies wildly depending on class. So again, from that Guardian article, Camilla is self-isolating separately from Charles at Birkhall and will carry on doing so for 14 days. They have a small team of domestic staff who will remain there, sources have said. The couple are not said to be interacting with that small team of staff in any way. So the first bit of that, I think, is the most important. We know that official government advice is for whole household isolation. That's not a big problem if no one in your household is vulnerable. So me, for example, myself, I live with my partner who's a similar age to me. If one of us gets sick, it's not a big deal that both of us get sick. But there are many people who live with a vulnerable person in their household. So an older person or someone with pre-existing conditions. I think that will be one of the biggest worries going on amongst many ordinary families in Britain at the moment. When the government were asked about this, in a press conference last Monday, when they first announced the whole household isolation system, they said, "Oh, I suppose people will have to use their own judgment." So this idea that, well, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that the differentials between how COVID-19 affects you depending on your class position is wildly different. Are you able to isolate yourself from vulnerable family members when you come down with the symptoms of COVID-19 is going to be a key vector of how the next few weeks and months feel for you, and also how likely your loved ones are to get sick. Ash, I want to get your thoughts on this.
The pace and effectiveness of the testing that Prince Charles received should be available for every single person in this country. That should be the standard that everyone has access to through the NHS. But because of the complacency and the lack of preparedness from our government, who have known since January that they would have to have a hugely expanded test and trace program, that they would have to manufacture things like ventilators, that kind of work, simply wasn't done really until last week to expand that capacity. Charles tested positive after displaying mild symptoms. I've got friends who are currently in close contact with COVID-19 patients working in the NHS. They're doctors, they're nurses. They're often working without adequate personal protective equipment. Lots have been told to only wear flimsy surgical masks unless they're literally intubating someone, and that's when they can get the proper respirators. And they are not getting tested. Now, what that means is that they've got the potential, if they are carrying COVID-19, to infect more patients. They're coming into contact with very sick people, not all of whom have coronavirus. And if they've got caring duties outside of the hospital, so perhaps they live with elderly relatives, perhaps they've got children, perhaps they are related to or in close contact with people who've got underlying health conditions, is that they don't know if they are going to give them this disease, which we know can be very, very nasty and has got a much higher mortality rate than seasonal flu. It is outrageous that our NHS gave preferential treatment to people, more than two people potentially. We don't know how Idris Elba and his wife got tested, and I love Idris Elba, don't get me wrong, that they get preferential treatment on account of being rich and famous. Camilla got tested despite displaying no symptoms whatsoever. And there are people who are symptomatic in hospitals at the moment who are struggling to get that test. I think that what this displays is, you know, Nick Robinson either was saying something incredibly stupid or incredibly funny, and I can't work out which it was. The idea that we're all in this together just rings so, so hollow. When people on the front line of fighting this virus can't get a test, but someone who is the son of the Queen can. We're not all in this together, quite clearly. Coronavirus doesn't abide by class distinction, but the availability of testing certainly does.
Before I go to you, Aaron, I want to bring up, some more examples of, I suppose, the unequal distribution of equipment and resources when it comes to tackling COVID-19. So first, I want to go to a tweet from Richard Horton. We've brought him up a few times on the show. He's editor of The Lancet. So it's Britain's most prestigious medical journal. He's been collecting stories from the front line. So today he tweeted, NHS COVID-19 alert. Today was shambolic in terms of PPE, so that's personal protective equipment, writes one frontline doctor. Although shortages are fewer, too many health workers have zero access. One nurse was advised to close her eyes if a patient with suspected illness coughed. Guidance is lacking. On top of that, of course, we can't forget the image from the weekend of nurses on a COVID ward at Northwick Park Hospital, wearing bin bags to protect themselves from the virus. So we can probably get one of those pictures up now. And I mean, Aaron, I'll go to you. It tells you something about our society's priorities when princes can get tested in their castles whilst nurses have to wear bin bags or close their eyes in case their coronavirus patient has to cough. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't that surprised. I mean, look, we are a monarchy. He is going to be the next head of state. I mean, yeah, he's going to get preferential treatment. What I found quite funny was that the Scottish government gave advice to not head to the Highlands a few days before he was, as you say, tested in Aberdeen, which is just kind of mildly amusing. And yeah, there's the symbolism there of a royal being tested in his own home, compared to how NHS workers aren't being tested and they're confronting dozens of people with this condition potentially every single day. But we're a monarchy. We've checked. And the thing that gets me is that, a lot of people consent to that. A lot of people think we should be a monarchy. I'm a Republican, but I'm also not under any illusions that most people think the monarchy is great. And that they think that these hierarchies are justified. I don't. I think one of the big political battles of my lifetime is that in the next 30 years, we don't have a monarchy anymore. We become a republic because all people are born equal. But right now, that's the system we have. And sadly, I think most subjects, not citizens, most fellow subjects think that's okay.
We are going to move in a moment to another story from today about a possibility of new mass testing. This isn't a test to find out whether you've got COVID-19, but whether you've had it in the past. First of all, you're watching Tizki Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. And I have to say now more than ever, we're dealing with new tech. Sometimes we need new equipment. You'll note we started a little bit late today. That's because we're still having a few teething problems. But I think we're getting there. And as we always say, if what we tend to ask from you is an hour's wage a month. If this month, because of the coronavirus crisis, you find yourself earning less or you're worried about your job, obviously we'll completely understand if you can't put any cash our way. But if you're someone who's getting your regular income and have less to spend it on because no one's going to the pub these days, it's actually harder to spend money when you just stay in your house, then pop as a bonus, a COVID-19 bonus, as it were. Also, make sure you like this video. It means it helps us on the algorithm. Keep your comments coming. Tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour, and we will be going to your comments and questions throughout the show. Next story. Limited access to testing for anyone but the extremely ill or the rich and famous has been one of the key challenges the NHS has faced in their struggle against COVID-19. At the Daily Downing Street press conference today, Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, blamed the shortage on problems in the global supply chain, which for me only begs the question why we are so ill-equipped to produce the components needed for testing compared to our neighbours. But there was potentially good news today about another form of testing. Not for whether someone currently has COVID-19, but for whether they have had it in the past. In Parliament today, Professor Sharon Peacock, Director of the National Infection Service at Public Health England, told MPs that the government had already ordered 3.5 million of these antibody tests and was about to order millions more. We're going to take a look at the write-up of this story by Sky. So first graphic, appearing before the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee via video link, Prof Peacock said the new tests were rapidly being evaluated at a laboratory in Oxford, with 3.5 million having already been ordered. Further millions are being ordered today, Prof Peacock told MPs. She added, in the near future, people will be able to order a test so they can test themselves or go to Boots or somewhere similar to have their finger prick test done. Asked if the availability of the test to the public would be a number of days rather than weeks or months, she replied, absolutely. I'll go to you first, Aaron. A lack of tests has been a major problem in terms of this country containing coronavirus. Do you think that this announcement here could be, a game changer?
Well, it sounds kind of weird, right? I mean, it sounds too good to be true. How, what's the accuracy? Most obviously with any testing, there's always a margin of error. There's a certain certain percentage of people won't have accurate results, pregnancy testing kits, etc. I mean, it just seems really odd. Last week we thought that testing kits would be highly expensive, labor intensive, professionally administered, and now all of a sudden millions of people are going to be able to use these ultra cheap kits almost, it seems, within days, and they'll get accurate results immediately. So my instinct is, wow, where did that come from? But if it's there, fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing. The initial Guardian write-up of this story, actually, when I first read it, I was like, wow, maybe this whole crisis is over. Because it just seemed like, millions of us were going to get sent testing. And then suddenly we'd be like South Korea, where they've dealt with it quite well. Everyone knows whether or not they have coronavirus. I think it turns out that some of the write-ups, got a bit overexcited. So as far as I understand it, these tests that are being talked about wouldn't tell you if you have COVID-19, which means that it's not particularly helpful for this idea of tracing and containing. So you work out if someone has COVID-19, then you make them stay in their house, and then you find everyone they've been in contact with, test them for COVID-19, and if they have it, you make them stay in their houses. So that's the way of containing coronavirus where it exists. This would be an antibody test. So what that tells you is not whether you have COVID-19, but whether you've had it in the past. And it tests you for that by finding out whether you have what the antibodies that are capable of attacking, whether you have immunity to COVID-19 fundamentally. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it would help our economy start moving and help many of the ordinary aspects of society continue, because many people might find out they've already had COVID-19, many people without realizing, and that means they're no longer vulnerable to it for at least a while. As we've talked about on the show before, it's unclear how long that immunity will last. But that would be a game changer, especially for the NHS, because at the moment you've got NHS workers who are taking time off. They've got no choice to, but they're taking time off because they've got a cough. If half of the NHS realize, they've had COVID-19 already, then the next time they get a cough, they don't have to worry about it. The other thing it can do, and this is what the chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, seemed very excited about at today's Downing Street press conference, was that you can, if you sort of take a random sample of the public and give them this test, you can work out how widespread COVID-19 was in the population. And that's helpful for your modeling to work out how close to the peak you are, or if you're already over it. Ash, any thoughts on this mass testing? Potentially it's going to be going out via Amazon through 3.5 million people's doors.
I mean, look, inshallah, this test is as accurate as the write-ups are saying. And as Aaron said, you do sometimes get false positives and false negatives with various forms of testing. But hopefully this will be accurate. As far as I understand it, it's a bit like taking a blood sugar test if you're a diabetic with the finger prick, which is fairly straightforward. People can do it. They don't need supervision while they do it. All those things are brilliant. I don't necessarily think that it being commercially available immediately would be a good thing. And the reason why I think that is because what we've seen with lots of the goods that people need during this pandemic is that markets have not been an efficient way of making sure that people who really need an item the most are able to get that item. The priority absolutely has to be workers in the NHS, key workers who are coming into contact with large numbers of people and those who are vulnerable. And then after that, people who have familial caring obligations, who perhaps share a household with people who have health conditions or are elderly. And then after those first priority tests, because really that frees up huge sections of the population to be able to take on that really crucial work of caring for other people. Then commercial availability, being able to pick it up in Boots, and I imagine there'd be quite a run on it, to me seems appropriate. But first and foremost, it's got to go to those who need it most, not simply those who are able to get to the shops and have the money to spend.
We've got a very powerful tweet on the hashtag Tiski Sour from Victoria Jesper. She tweets, emotional effect on staff is extremely potent right now. Tears daily. We are all on edge, unwittingly coming into contact with COVID-19 positive patients, aware that without testing, we might be super spreaders, and some having vulnerable family at home who are at risk. Victoria Jesper is a radiographer, so someone who does x-rays.
I mean, that rings true for a lot of the things that I've been hearing from some of my friends. And I've actually felt in two minds about tweeting about it or talking about it publicly, because on the one hand, you really want to share these stories and tell people what it's really like in hospitals at the minute. And on the other hand, you're worried about scaring people, right? You're really worried about scaring people. But talking to a friend of mine who is a doctor, a couple of years older than me, so quite a young guy. We were at the same sixth form, and he was just saying like, "Yep, it's really horrible. I'm just watching people die, and there's not very much I can do to help them get better." And how that feels as a medic to be so disempowered, knowing it's going to get worse, must just be completely emotionally overwhelming, and not even having the time to be able to look after your mental health or seek out professional support as well, because it's all hands on deck all the time. um I've got nothing but empathy, solidarity, and respect for these frontline workers in the NHS. There was also the very sad story that came out today of an intensive care nurse who took her own life. Now, I've got no idea what other factors may have been at play. We know that there were COVID-19 fatalities in the intensive care unit where she worked, and it, I think that's one of the things that has gone underreported, perhaps, is just what the cumulative emotional toll of this is going to be on frontline workers. And the fact that there are elements of that stress, particularly around things like personal protective equipment not being available, testing not being available, which are being actively worsened by the government's policy failures. And that's why I'm not going to shut up about holding the government to account over these things, because there's a human cost to it, and it was avoidable.
I suppose on a much less profound level, I was thinking today about what the emotional reaction is going to be to these antibody results if they do become, available en masse. And I was thinking on one level, if you get the positive results, so if it says that you've had COVID-19, you're like, yes, I've hit the jackpot, because that means that you no longer have to either worry about getting it or giving it to someone else. You can fundamentally live your life almost as usual. But then the flip side of that is going to be, how many people did I give it to? Because if you know that you've had COVID-19 and you don't know when you had it, no one's going to have any idea whether they're, I mean, it's a horrible phrase anyway, isn't it? But no one's going to know if they were a super spreader or not, because we've got no idea. I suppose because of the lack of testing from the start of this crisis, we've got no idea who's the pattern of how this disease has been spread, or not much.
Can I just come in, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's two things. There was an article in The Guardian today with Nouriel Roubini. Everybody should read it, which is just basically an overview as to the economic dimensions of what's happening, what's going to happen over the next year, 18 months. And then he speculates about something which is quite plausible, which is that we get on top of this before the end of the year, by winter, let's say by autumn, because of commercial testing like this, commercially available testing like this. And we can begin to return back to normal quite slowly, take it step by step. But there would be some mutations, and that you might get mutations becoming more of a problem during the traditional flu season of 2020, 2021. And that might then again lead to people having to be staying indoors more than they would like, more remote working than they would like, etc. So there is the possibility of actually trying to come out of this too quickly. I mean, Nouriel Roubini, aka Dr. Doom, he was one of the few economists to predict the 2008 crisis. He's an economist, he's not an epidemiologist. But it's one of the scenarios that's being planned in terms of any economic flatline. So that's the first one. The evolution of the virus. The second one is, we don't know, as you've said already, we don't know about the immune response. We don't know how long it lasts for. We talked about this with Steve Turner a little while ago. Normally it's a season with a cold. Is it going to be one season? Will it be 3 months? Will it be 5 years? And so somebody might have resistance to it. They might have created the antibodies, say, wow, I've already had this, I can go back to work again. And they might get sick 3 or 6 months later, because we don't actually know that much about this disease. And so again, it feeds back into my original response about this whole thing, which is, it seems odd to me that a virus which nobody knew existed 4 months ago now has this commercially available test. You can get it within days. 2.5 million people are going to be able to access it. It's going to have a significant accuracy, and it's going to be able to tell people when they can return to the labour market, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it just seems a lot of if, buts, and maybes, given that we should be trying to err on the side of caution with regards to COVID-19 as a public health issue.
Yeah. I mean, there's a worry that we jump headfirst into it because the government is so desperate for people to go back to work that they're happy to take these kind of risks. That's the worry, isn't it? We are going to now talk about the National Voluntary Service, or what's been called the NHS Army. So it's no secret the coronavirus crisis is testing all of our historically underfunded services to their limit. This applies most acutely to our hospitals, but also social services more generally. In particular, having 1.5 million people confined to their homes for at least 12 weeks, we've at this time got no idea how long that's going to go on, raises a challenge in terms of providing people with necessary food, medicine, and mental and emotional support. So one proposed solution to this challenge was announced yesterday by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. It was the creation of a 250,000 strong National Voluntary Service, or what's been called the NHS Army. This is how Health Secretary Matt Hancock described the aims of the new scheme and what the government is looking for.
250,000 volunteers, people in good health, to help the NHS for shopping and for delivery of medicines, and to support those who are shielded to protect their own health. The NHS Volunteer Responders is a new scheme set up so that people can come and help, and to make sure that the NHS and the local services that are needed get all the support that they can.
So details, he went on to give details of the tasks the volunteers will be asked to do. You can find those at the moment on the NHS website. I think we can get those up. So it says NHS volunteer responders can be called on to do simple but vital tasks, such as delivering medicines from pharmacies, driving patients to appointments, bringing them home from hospital, or making regular phone calls to check on people isolating at home. The public response to the announcement has been pretty goddamn resounding. By 9:45 this morning, the NHS had met their target, so 250,000 people had applied to join the service. And Boris Johnson announced today at about 5 p.m. that it's now at 405 100,000. I'm going to go to you first, Ash. What do you make of this? Is it an opportunistic throwback to David Cameron's big society, saving the government money by using volunteers to plug holes in a hollowed out state, or a sensible mobilization of community spirit in a time of national crisis?
I mean, look, there are going to be some people on the left who really don't like me for this, but I think there's been like an element of contrarianism about rejecting this as opportunistic and, evil and immoral in some way, when in the same breath celebrating the work being done by those mutual aid networks, which were set up a couple of weeks ago. This to me seems like a centralization and to some degree a professionalization of that work. So making sure that people have DBS checks, making sure that resources and manpower directed to those who most need it. I think that's a very welcome thing. Also, you can't underestimate the fact that people really want to help. They want to feel like they're doing something and they're not just abandoning the issue and letting people who already work for the NHS deal with it. So I actually think it's a very good thing. What it isn't, however, is a substitute for the kind of systematic under-resourcing and understaffing of public services that we have seen in the past decade. So over 400,000 volunteers to do this kind of work of delivering medicine, getting people to appointments, and making phone calls to check on people who are isolated and alone. That doesn't make up for the fact that in England we're down 17,000 hospital beds. It doesn't make up for the fact there is this huge staffing shortage of both doctors and of nurses. It doesn't make up for the fact that we don't have enough ventilators nor enough trained staff to operate them. However, I don't think that that's the claim being made. And so I think it's really important for people on the left to be able to distinguish between, what is actually the object of your ire. I'm never going to condemn people for wanting to be mobilized to help out people in their community. That's the basis of my politics, as I'm sure it is for you, Michael, and Aaron as well. But it's not a substitute for a well-resourced and prepared state.
Aaron.
Yeah, I thought Ash put it really well. I'm not adverse to it. I agree with Ash as well that there's a weird kind of double standard here. We believe in voluntarism, mutual aid, and the state seems to be doing that in a relatively organized way. At the end of the day, look, this is an emergency situation. We've got to be wary of that being built into the everyday reproduction of public service provision, aka the big society. I mean, but this isn't that. We have a situation where we have a pandemic on a scale in this country that's not been seen since 1918, 1919. And so given that, I think it's only right, whoever's in government, we could have a socialist government, we could have a government spending, tens of billions more on the NHS. You still would have some kind of measure, a voluntary mobilization, whether it was maintaining contact with elderly people, delivering food, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if the state's going to coordinate some of that, fine. I don't really see the problem. But yeah, of course, you need to be vigilant to that not becoming a central part of welfare provision.
Yeah, I mean that was always the critique of the big society. So the big society was an idea put forward by David Cameron and one of his advisors, Steve Hilton, who's now gone on to be a Fox News pundit. And it was an idea that you can sort of roll back the welfare state and replace it with voluntary services. And it was initially one of the big justifications for austerity. Basically, it fell away, and austerity was argued for nearly entirely on economic terms. But that gave voluntary action basically a bad name because it was seen as a justification for rolling back state services. And obviously, you've got a bunch of problems there, which is one, if something's based on volunteerism, then it's no longer a right. It becomes something which is conditional on someone else's willingness to help you. Also, what you found in many situations. So, for example, Kids Company was one example where you replace a council providing a service with a charity. Then, if that charity, collapses, which Kids Company did at one point, a bunch of scandals, then suddenly there's loads and loads of people in need, vulnerable people, who suddenly have no help anymore. Because the state has basically washed their hands of responsibility and handed it over to voluntary organizations. so in general, if people are arguing you should have voluntary organisations to replace state services, that's something to be a little bit wary of. I think, but I mean, I agree with both of you fundamentally. 2 points here is that, one, even if you should not have voluntary service as a replacement for a safety net, it's still good to have it. People like to. There's lots of lonely people in this country, and not that I'm saying everyone who applies to this is lonely, but lots of people who want to be involved in some sort of social program, who want to be meeting more people, helping more people, having a bit more purpose, and I think it just makes total sense to utilize that. Also, in this situation, it is different, as you said, Ash, from the big society argument, because we are in an exceptional period of time. So even from the left, a model of crisis management where what you do is basically pay the wages of unemployed, or pay the wages of people who can't do their jobs to keep their existing jobs, and then encourage them to do voluntary action until they can go back to work on the floor in the car plant or whatever. That to me seems like quite a sensible model of crisis management. If you're paying people 80% of their wages that they'd normally get in their retail job, and now you're saying, well, as we're paying you for doing that, but you can't do that because of the crisis we're in, maybe you'd like to do some volunteering. Obviously, it has to be, genuinely voluntary, not a kind of weird workfare situation. But I think that works. I mean, the demand for me has to be that whilst there are lots of people in this country at the moment who've been promised 80% of their wages, and that puts you in quite a nice, comfortable situation to go and do some volunteering on the side, there are way too many people. There are still way too many people who haven't had their income guaranteed over this period of time. So that ideal model of crisis management I've just painted isn't yet happening, and that's the demand we should be making, instead of trashing what to me seems like on its own quite a good policy. And I think it's nice that 400,000 people have applied. You are watching Tiskisau, you're watching Novara Media. There's over 1,700 of you watching it at the moment. We want to get that to over 2,000. So if you go below the YouTube video, there'll be a link to a tweet advertising the show. If you give that a retweet, not only do you share the lovely thumbnail that Fox, our producer, made, but also you will direct more people to this show. Our final story of the evening, before we go to some questions, so you can start getting those in now, is not related to coronavirus. I mean, maybe we'll link it back to coronavirus, but fundamentally it's a different story. This is that today was Jeremy Corbyn's final appearance as opposition leader at Prime Minister's Questions. So the outgoing Labour leader has stood opposite David Cameron for 29 PMQs, Theresa May for 93, and this will be his 14th. Well, this was his 14th against Boris Johnson.
I believe in a decent, socially just society. And he was talking as though this was a sort of obituary. Just to let him know, my voice will not be stilled. I'll be around, I'll be campaigning, I'll be arguing, and I'll be demanding justice for the people of this country and indeed the rest of the world.
Ash.
I mean, I watched that, and like a lot of people, I felt incredibly moved, because I look at Jeremy Corbyn and look at what's been done to him by the media, by the Conservative Party, and by more than a few MPs on his own benches. And I think that every single one of them should hang their head in shame, because it's one thing to hold the powerful to account, and rightly so. Jeremy Corbyn should have been held to account. He should have been criticised, and he should have been scrutinised. But he was consistently presented as something that he wasn't, as someone who was motivated by some kind of, base desire for power, someone who was mean-spirited, someone who lacked moral fortitude, which is the complete opposite of the man. As anyone who has worked with him, met him, or had contact with him through his role as Islington North's MP can attest. So on the one hand, I do feel this great sense of anger, I suppose, for what's been done to his character in the public arena, which has gone far beyond holding the powerful to account. But there's also an intense sense of gratitude. When Jeremy Corbyn first became leader of the Labour Party in 2015, I remember talking to you, Aaron, a lot about it, because I don't think I saw the potential at that point. I was still a kind of snarky anarchist who thought that all electoralism was a terrible compromise with the state and shouldn't be done. What I didn't see was the space that he would open up for a truly different kind of politics. One where instead of competing over who could be the least miserable electoral option at the ballot box, you can go out and you can fight for things that you truly believe in. Before Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, don't forget what they were offering was austerity light. They were boasting that they would cut deeper than Thatcher, that they would be hard on welfare recipients. As a Muslim woman growing up under the war on terror, the way in which my community was demonized, scapegoated, had our civil liberties suppressed and undermined. I never thought that the Labour Party or the Labour movement would have space for a more just kind of politics. And it didn't until Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell and Diane Abbott took over leadership. And for that, I will be intensely grateful. And in the last few weeks during this crisis presented by the pandemic, if I'm honest, none of the leadership candidates, I feel, have stepped up to the plate. Not a single one of them has behaved like the leader of the opposition in waiting. It's been Jeremy Corbyn, it's been John McDonnell holding the government to account and fighting for the most vulnerable people and most vulnerable workers that exist in our society. Now, obviously, we did not win. We fell at the final hurdle of the 2019 election. There are still huge lessons to be learned from it. However, the one thing that shouldn't be taken from it is that we should abandon our principles and abandon the principles of social justice, of democratizing every sphere of public life, of ending the poisonous influence of inequality on our society. There is no going back to before 2015. That's just a different path to losing.
Yeah, I think what's really important to remember is that Jeremy Corbyn, along with Nigel Farage, is probably the most influential British politician of the last 10 years. And Nigel Farage, forget becoming Prime Minister, never even won a parliamentary seat. But the margins define the centre. And when it came to issues around immigration, when it came to issues around what we call historically race relations, Nigel Farage has determined so much of the conversation. But then in terms of the redistributive aspect of taxation, when it comes to public transport, when it comes to university tuition fees, when it comes to how the economy is rigged, Jeremy Corbyn and Labour under his helmsmanship has had a massive, massive role. And just to compound again what Ash has said, in terms of the next wave of leaders, Lisa Nandy, I'm not such a big fan of. She's pretty good media performer. The reason being she's spent years doing the Andrew Neil show. You get better at it. It's like exercise, right? As Michael will attest, he's now always doing these shows. And Ash, they're fantastic at doing it. The more you do it, the better you get. But she's not. I don't agree with her politically. Keir Starmer and Rebecca Long-Bailey are perfectly competent politicians. I can imagine them being in a centre-left or a left-wing Labour government and having senior roles. However, neither of them strikes me as a leader, as a political leader. Neither of them has stepped up. And I certainly don't see either of them shaping the conversation in that way, like I say, reminiscent of either of Nigel Farage for the worse, in my opinion, or for Jeremy Corbyn in the case of reshaping the economy for working people. So Jeremy Corbyn's legacy is a significant one. One area where I think he failed, and by the way, I don't think he failed because he failed to become Prime Minister. I'll talk about that more in a second. One area I think he did fail, John McDonnell failed, Diane Abbott failed, the Labour left failed, was in their inability to democratise the party. Because whatever else you might say about the structural impediments to a socialist Labour government were too big, even if they won the 2017 election, which, by the way, they were fewer than 2,500 votes away from potentially forming a government. That's how close Labour came to forming a government in 2017. Even if they won that, they would have had all this kind of the major backlash. They had very few allies in the media. They had compared to the Tories, a very weak think tank policy formation, sort of infrastructure, all true. But they could have got through mandatory selection. They could have democratized the party. They could have made sure that the threshold for people to get on the ballot to run for leadership positions, deputy leadership positions, was lower. They could have made the NEC more reflective of the party more broadly. They could have democratized sub-aspects of the party like Young Labour, BAME Labour. They could have made Labour students an effective organising arm of the party in university campuses, just like Turning Point are in the United States. Why isn't the left doing that? Why isn't the Labour Party doing that in Britain? So that's where they failed for me, was on internal strategic orientation and democratic reform. Now, on the external stuff, I actually think they did really well, despite not winning a general election. And like I said, I think they've changed Labour's policy offer for a very long time to come. The best case scenario for Jeremy Corbyn would have been winning the 2017 general election. Let's say they form a government with the SNP, having maybe some kind of majority of 5, 10, could have been confidence and supply, could have been a formal coalition. And the reality is that wouldn't have lasted very long because of the countervailing pressures from the establishment, from the media, from within his own party. And I think a good analogue for us on the left to think about here is Ted Heath. Ted Heath won the 1970 general election. He made some overtures of being a different kind of conservative, an economic liberal, but he didn't really change very much. And actually, they were still effectively, they were Keynesians. And this is something that people like Alistair Campbell don't understand. Ted Heath was in office, but he was not in power. The actual economic framework within which he operated was very much the post-1945 one. So when we say that Tony Blair is a neoliberal, it's like saying that Ted Heath is a Keynesian. They didn't really disrupt the general political and economic context which they stepped into. Clement Attlee did that. Margaret Thatcher did that. Could Jeremy Corbyn have done that after 2017? I don't think he could have. I think our best bet would have been him being a Ted Heath-style figure, maybe scrapping tuition fees, maybe reforming the electoral system, but winning 1, 2 terms, transforming the UK economy, given all those countervailing pressures, I think that would have been too much. I think a politician will do it in the future, and I think Britain's next transformational prime minister will come from the left, but I think we're going to have to wait at least 5, 10 years.
I want to just get up 3 tweets that I've already, summarized the 3 takes that people had about Jeremy Corbyn, which I noticed today. So one was from someone called Ellen. Big up Jeremy Corbyn for giving me something to passionately give a shit about for the last 4.5 years that I will continue to passionately give a shit about long after he's stepped down. The good. And then you had Kevin Maguire, who's political editor at the Daily Mirror. Johnson's a prize hypocrite to gush praise for Corbyn when he's previously smeared Labour's outgoing leader as a dangerous terrorist-loving anti-Semite. Johnson should have apologised for what he said then or said nothing now. So that's the argument that Corbyn's been unjustly smeared. And then finally, from Ian Dunt, host of Romaniacs, who... Well, anyway, tremendous relief that today is Corbyn's last PMQs, 5 years of utterly ineffective opposition, allowing historically shambolic Tory governments to get away with whatever the hell they want. What a tragic, wasteful, piss-poor experiment in delusion this has been.
I mean, a bit rich of Ian Dunt to talk about tragic, wasteful, piss-poor experiments in delusion. Considering it was hard to remain, he helped deliver us a hard Brexit. They played a zero-sum game and they lost. And one of the reasons why they lost is that they weren't willing to work with the leader of the opposition to get the thing that they wanted most in the world, which was a shot at a second referendum. There were various points, particularly during that intractable parliamentary impasse, where they could have done that, where they could have supported a Jeremy Corbyn-led minority government, and they didn't.
It's interesting. I mean, yeah, go on, Aaron.
I think that the Dunt tweet is really emblematic for a certain genre of politics. People like Ian Dunt, it's interesting, isn't it? We're on the left at Navarro Media, the 3 people on the screen right now, with different politics, but we're all on the left. We have a propositional politics. We view ourselves as part of a broader political project. Ian Dunt's politics seems to be anti-Brexit, anti-Jeremy Corbyn. What are you for? You need to have a propositional politics. And so there's a limit to that sort of FPPE style politics. Some of them are on the left, by the way, and they'll come back. Some of them are former Tories or whatever. But in and of itself, it's not a propositional politics. Nash is right. People are saying, Jeremy Corbyn, he's an idiot, piss poor exercise and delusion. he almost became prime minister twice, 2017, 2019. 2019 was because of the political myopia of people like Dunt, Joe Swinson, etc. But 2017, wow, he was in touching distance of the biggest political upset in British political history.
I mean, Corbynism does have a stronger legacy in British politics than the movement for a second referendum. I don't think that's particularly controversial to say, is it? I mean, one of them shifted economic common sense so that, supporting austerity now is seen as a weird position, as opposed to what was a completely hegemonic one just 5 years ago, before Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. Whereas now that the failure of the second referendum movement means that the whole idea of being pro-European just seems a bit like, weird and out of touch. And what's the point? We're all over it now.
Don't write off the FBP lot. The political wing of Ocado will rise again.
Ocado's doing very well at the moment. Now is the time for Ocado. Buy shares in Ocado. They're the delivery company that used to be attached to Waitrose. I don't know if they are anymore. But in any case,
listen, that's above my pay grade, darling.
Well, they're ahead. Delivery services are where you want to be right now. Okay, we
get out of the podcast game, Ash. There's nothing left for you here.
I think the future direction of people like Ian Dunt, they've got three options. Either you get involved in a kind of Rishi Sunak, reformulated Macmillan-style politics on the Tory centre right. That could happen. You basically join a left project which goes all the way from Ian Dunt all the way to the radical left, and Labour's a big tent and it works. Or you do the whole rejoin thing. They've got three options, and people like Ian Dunt. I mean, I've heard them slag off Navarro on their podcast and so on. You can do that if you want to have any agency, if you want to have any influence in terms of the future travel of British politics and how we run our society. Suck it up and work with people you don't agree with on everything, because that's how the world works. Get used to it.
And it's something that the right are very good at doing.
We're going to go to comments and questions. We put out a tweet earlier asking who out of the three of us has the best backdrop. At Murder tweets on the hashtag Whiskey Sour. I think Ash wins for best posters, Michael best headphones, but Aaron for best overall backdrop. Every leftist has a shelf that looks like that. I don't know if that's kind of an exclusive thing to say. You can be a leftist without a million books, but many a leftist, I suppose, has
that's
a backdrop.
Just you,
like
Michael, because you're like, I like podcasts, babe.
No.
I like podcasts and articles.
Oh, wow.
It's not what you think. Wait. I'm sorry, guys.
What are you showing? I can't. You're a bit too small on my screen. What was the second thing you showed? I saw Andrew Neil.
Alistair Campbell Diaries.
Oh, Alistair Campbell Diaries. To be honest, I do have that one. Matty
signed
X
by John McTernan himself.
What will be the best counterpoints when the Tories tried to argue this was all a special circumstance and for a return to austerity as usual?
Well, look, Aaron's right. There is no going back to normal after this. The labour market will be forever changed and things will not simply go back to January 2020. And so there will be some changes which will accelerate once the immediate crisis of the pandemic is resolved. The automation of white-collar jobs will be a huge one. And so that kind of precarity in the labour market, that kind of economic precarity, is not going to go away. So your response to that can either be a slash and burn race to the bottom, which I think after people have gone through an incredibly traumatic time, not just economically, of course, but in terms of what they've witnessed and perhaps what they've themselves experienced. Or you can make the case for not just a strengthened social provision, strengthened welfare provision, but transformation in how people access the means of survival entirely. And that would mean making the case for things like universal basic income. That would mean making the case for the nationalization of services that we all rely on, not just failing industries and ones which have been in trouble, but ones that we need in order to function, the ones that we need in order to work. The last few weeks have shown that the idea which everyone laughed at and scorned of free fiber optic broadband makes a lot of sense in terms of the kind of economy that we have and the kinds of needs that people have. So I think that those windows are open. I think the difficult thing will be, as ever, shaping not just a propositional politics which works in terms of policies, but making it feel emotionally resonant and immediate and urgent. Um, However, I think the tragedy and the trauma um, of what's going to come in the next couple of months uh, will mean that certain conversations that seemed impossible a few months ago will suddenly be happening all the time.
Aaron, a question from Vandy Mina. If the margins define the centre, is it worth having a radical left protest party like UKIP or the Tea Party but for the left?
Firstly, the Tea Party, very effective. However, in the United States, they have a primary system. If we had a primary system in Britain, I think the exact same thing would have happened here. I think UKIP wouldn't have been a new party. It would have just been a faction within the Tory party, and they would have primaried Conservative Party MPs, just like the Tea Party did with the Republicans. The left would do something here. It's interesting. If you look at the Democrats, how has the radical left begun to shape the debate? Not as successfully as perhaps we would like. It's been through primarying establishment Democrats. The most kind of high-profile example that's been Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So that's the first thing. Would a Tea Party model work here? I suspect not, because of the absence of the primary system. If we had a PR system, a proportional representation system, a more proportional system than what we have, I think a radical left party would most certainly shape the agenda of the dominating centre-left party. Again, we don't have that here. What we do have is a first past the post system, which often tends to privilege either regionalist / nationalist parties, see Sinn Féin in the early 20th century, or more recently the SNP, or single issue parties. So I don't think the left would succeed in setting up its own party under first past the post where there weren't primaries. I don't think it would work. If you want a secessionist movement, if you want a regionalist movement, yes, then it's effective. But for the left, no. And that's why I think the campaign democratized the Labour Party, so that something resembling primaries in the US can happen here is one that's worth pursuing.
One question for each of you, and then we'll call it a night. And we're going to go to you, Ash. Amelie Silvani Jones asks, still no announcement for renters. Should renters be organising to rent strike in light of the mortgage holidays?
Well, I think that organising a rent strike in some ways, it's going to happen anyway. It's whether or not it's a collective rather than an atomized endeavour, and whether or not it has one which has a shared political umbrella and shared demands. I think that in some ways it's very difficult to do things like organise a rent strike where it's not as if tenants are held together by a shared identity, right? There have been places in the UK where it's been tried and hinted at, and usually it's sort of been concentrated around university halls because there's a clear landlord and there's a shared experience of the tenants. And so really, it's not until you have this kind of exogenous shock to the economy, which throws the entire rental market into chaos, where you suddenly have a if not an organized rent strike under a shared umbrella and shared purpose, the possibility of mass non-compliance with rent payments rearing its head. Now, I hope and I think that there will be further measures to protect renters, simply because the ones which have been announced by Rishi Sunak are completely inadequate for the scale of the crisis at hand. It's essentially an extension on the notice period given by the landlord in order to evict tenants. It's not protection at all. There's also a huge change to the rental market coming in terms of Airbnb is in collapse. The Airbnb landlords have got no income. Many of them are falling behind on their rent payments or indeed their mortgage payments. And so you will have a flood of properties entering the long-term rental market, which had previously been on Airbnb, which is also going to do something in collapsing the price of rents. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The role that I think collective non-compliance of rent can play is that you're essentially casting a light on the cracks and fissures in the system. You're demanding political action meets the crisis as it is. Whether or not it will be successful in sort of being the glue that holds together a broader housing movement, which continues after the pandemic draws to a close, I don't know. I certainly hope so.
I'm going to go to my final question, or your final question, to Aaron in a moment. First of all, we might not be shaking hands these days, but we can still like videos on Twitter. Not Twitter, sorry, YouTube. We have 900 likes at the moment. We know that there's about 1,700 of you watching. Is it nearly? I don't know what the numbers are at the moment. But anyway, there's more of you watching than have liked this. So you can all go and like this video. That means it appears in more people's feeds. It will help us with the algorithm. Means more people watch Tisky Sour, watch Navarro Media. Get the kind of lefty ideas that we're putting out there, holding the government to account. Aaron. Hugh Morgan asks, do you think this will fundamentally shift the political economic analysis of some Tory MPs? This presumably being coronavirus.
Massively. This is it's huge. COVID-19 is huge. It's going to lead to geopolitical shifts. It's going to lead to shifts in the domestic economy, public service provision. It's massive. We talked about the IMF, the World Bank yesterday, talking to, I think, 12 countries in North Africa, West Asia, Central Asia, about potential debt defaults. You've got a combination of low oil prices and COVID-19. If you're Iran, if you're Iraq, Libya, that's some. I don't like to say it. I'm half Iranian, but that's some failed state shit. That's very hard to deal with. Saudi Arabia. So there's that element to it. And then you've got the whole retail model. Already this year we've had Beals, we've had Debenhams go into administration. Basically, no businesses out there on the high street really are generating a significant profit. That's a longer term story. But COVID-19 is like the coup de grace on that stuff. So whether it's the domestic economy, our jobs model, many people work in retail, or whether it's international relations, geopolitics, the global south, international development, it's a massive event, and I think its after effects, its consequences are going to be with us for a very long time.
That's a nice big picture answer to end the show. Thank you both, Aaron Bastani and Ash Sarkar, for joining me this evening. Navarro Media will be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be a Tisky Sour or an Ask Me Anything with two doctors, Rita Issa and Mesh Pillay. You'll have seen them both on our shows over the last 2 weeks. But in any case, make sure you tune in.
Anything. You can't be like, are you single? I mean, maybe you can be like,
I don't know. Maybe I think you might as well test it. Push the boundaries. Doctors have social lives too, Ash. They're not just machine. They're not just robots there to make us.
I know that, but I've been wanting to set them up with people.
I mean, they're both single and they're both good looking, so why not? There you go.
Tune in to Navarro Media tomorrow at 8 p.m. for a bunch of reasons. All right. Good night, both of you. Good night, everyone watching.
Night.